disappeared. In fact, one of the major research programs in linguistics today is a European Union program studying disappearing languages in Europe. They're called dialects. They're just different languages. And on the other hand, and this bears on globalization, the integration of Europe and the kind of move towards centralization and so on has set up a counter-reaction. So an increasing regionalization, and a lot of the regional languages are being revived with a good deal of commitment and intensity. And it's so in Spain, for example, Catalan is much more lively than under Franco. It was suppressed. You know, you walked in the streets of Barcelona, you never heard it, but now it's the language of Catalonia. You know, the Basque language has been revived considerably. Other so-called dialects like Asturian and others are also becoming, people always spoke them, but now they're speaking them self-consciously and interested in reviving them in the culture and so on. And it's happening elsewhere too. You walk in the streets of Wales and school children are speaking Welsh. These are there is a reaction to the centralization and integration, which is leading to revival of regional identities, local cultures, practices, folk songs, language, and so on. And I suspect we're seeing it's harder worldwide. This is a rich, privileged area, so lots of things can happen that aren't going to happen in the American Southwest or, you know, Aboriginal Australia. But still, I think something similar can be found. So the general process is one of leveling and destruction. On the other hand, the human beings are complicated creatures. They also struggle for their own rights. So you get counter reactions.
Beyond the political importance of studying Zazaca, theoretical linguists can benefit from the study of an undocumented language.
We are trying to put together a puzzle that has been scattered across all the languages of the world. That every language that we look at has something to contribute to our theoretical understanding of how human languages are put together. So I've been working with you on how questions are put together in Zazaca, and that's helped me to understand better how questions are put together more generally. There are things I understand better, for example, about a language from the Philippines that I work with, Tagalog, because of the things that you've taught me about how Zazaca works. So there are those kinds of connections. It's also important, I think, for the community who speak Zazaca themselves to understand that the language is a valuable and an important language, that it's got properties that are of great importance and interest to theoretical linguists.
The nature of the course then is to allow our students to put into practice some of the theory that they've learned in describing a language that's unfamiliar to them. And Zazaca is particularly interesting then. It's an Indo-European language. As you know, many Indo-European languages have been very well studied, but there are some that have not, and your language is one of them.
The class was conducted once a week for 14 weeks, supplemented by additional individual meetings between each student and Guljem Akhtash, the class's Zazaca consultant.
Interesting effects with vowel changes that we talked about a lot in the class so far.
We found that there are at least two different types of this construction, which is kind of surprising because it would and they show some kind of behavior which is also unexpected at first sight. So I'm trying to see exactly how these groups pattern together and try to give an account for.
Each graduate student spent the course of the semester writing a research paper on a particular topic in Zazaca grammar.
So I'm working on how Zazaca speakers mark the source of information they have for the claims that they make in their sentences. And I found it interesting because it's done in a very different way.
I'm interested in finding out what happens to words and other linguistic things when they're taken into Zazaca and made Zazaca. How do they change? And how do Zazaca speakers change them?
But I've been looking at our causatives, the way you say that somebody made someone do something, and I like that. I think that's really interesting.
Quite a few interesting phenomena which we are only beginning to understand. Things like, I'm sure people have already talked about evidentials, also the as effect construction. In linguistics, be it formal linguistics or any other kind, we're still really just beginning to get a grasp of how those kinds of structures work. And Zaza is a great language for exploring that. It's really important. One
of my main interests is in a lot of different languages is the way that questions are formed. Zazaca has a way of forming questions that allows you to either do nothing, leave a question word in situ, which is something we find in a bunch of different languages, or to move it to the front of the sentence by a variety of means. So you can ask questions like, so you can take a statement like "Es que tal dato," and you can change that to a question like "To que tal da kanji chineke," or you can make that into a question by taking kanji chineke and moving it to the front. So like kanji chineka ku to que tal da. That sort of optionality in that way of having a choice between two different ways of forming questions, that in itself is interesting. And the conditions on when you can use which of those types of questions, that's interesting as well. So there are a lot of very sort of complicated facts about the way questions are formed that are useful toward our understanding of human language more generally.
I didn't know that much about Kurdish society. I'd known about the Kurdish diaspora and so forth, and the fragmentation of the Kurdish nation across a bunch of national boundaries, but that was about it. I had never met, until I met you, until I met our interviewer, I had never met a Kurdish person ever.
After we started our work in the linguistics department on Zazaca, we decided to see how it might benefit other people in the MIT community and what the sort of general level of understanding and knowledge was about Zazaca and Kurdish language quite generally. So we decided to spend the afternoon polling random MIT students about what they know, and here's what we found.
I study mechanical engineering and electrical engineering.
Okay, we have an engineer here. Do you know what Zazaca is?
Zazacca. Not without any context.
No, okay.
No.
Any guesses or?
No, not off the top of my head.
Okay, what if I told you, which is actually true, that Zazaca is a language, where do you think it might be spoken?
It's tough. You know, I would guess possibly Central or South America, or possibly Africa, maybe, you know, somewhere in the Pacific Islands. But I don't know.
I wanted to ask you if you knew what Zazaca is.
Sorry, no.
Now, Zazaca is a language. Where do you think it's spoken?
Africa?
Africa. It turns out to be spoken by Kurds. So, what language would that make it most closely related to?
I have no idea.
Have you ever heard of a language called Zazaca?
No, I haven't.
Okay. Does it ring any bells? Do you have any guess where it might be spoken?
I assume I know most European languages, so I'm guessing it's not one of those. It might be one of the former Soviet ones. Might be an Asian, African, maybe it might be a Native American. I don't know. I have no guesses really.
Okay, it turns out Zazaca is spoken by Kurdish people.
Okay.
Now, do you have any guesses what languages Kurdish might be related to?
Arabic, or if there's a Turkish dialect, or Hindi possibly.
Zazaca? No, I don't know.
Just venture any guess. Zazaca.
It sounds foreign.
Yes.
It doesn't sound Western.
Yes, well, what if I told you, and in fact it is, Zazaca is a language. Zazaca is a language. Where is it spoken?
Must be in some Middle Eastern tribe.
Middle East. Very good, very close.
Sounds Indian.
It sounds Japanese. I have no idea.
Sounds Indian to you, Japanese to you. Now, if I told you that Zazaca was a language, where would you think it's spoken?
Zazaca is a West Iranian language spoken in southeast Anatolia, northwest to the Kurdi or Kurdish-speaking regions. Estimates of the number of speakers vary from 1 to 2.5 million people. The major cities where Zazaca is spoken include Diyarbakir, Darsim, Mush, El-Aziz, and Bingul on the upper courses of the Euphrates, Kızılırmak, and Murat rivers. In considering Zazaca, we may raise the question, what is the difference between a language and a dialect?
That's a very difficult question. Sort of in layman's terms, it would be that two varieties of the same language that are more or less mutually intelligible to one another. Structurally, it's very difficult to give a definition.
One thing that linguists often say about dialects versus languages, which you asked about earlier, is that a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. And that just goes to show that, again, it's more a matter of how people think of languages and what kind of social uses they have that determines whether we call a language versus a dialect.
A lot of linguists think that there actually are no such things as either languages or dialects. We have this tendency to define things as languages or dialects based on political criteria. So we call things dialects if they are close together and both within a single country, and we call them languages if they are in different countries. Those aren't the kinds of criteria that linguists are interested in, so there are no linguistic criteria that allow you to say these two things are dialects or these two things are languages. So for example, we customarily talk about the ways people speak in China, the Cantonese and Mandarin, for example. We talk about those and we call them dialects because they are both spoken in China, but they're no more similar to each other than Spanish and French. I mean, they're related, but they're not mutually intelligible. There's no real reason to call them dialects instead of languages. We call Norwegian and Swedish different languages because they're spoken in different countries, but they are mutually intelligible. Someone who only speaks Norwegian, someone who only speaks Swedish or Danish, they can understand each other. So it's not clear that there is a good definition of language or dialect. So this is a dictionary of Kurmanji. You were asking me earlier about differences between Kurmanji and Zazaca. It's very clear looking at the end that there are a number of them. So, you know, my book in this language apparently is Pertukamin. In your language, I guess it would be Kataben. I guess what all this means is that if someone tries to belittle a way of speaking by saying, well, that's just a dialect, it's not a real language. For a linguist, that kind of claim has no meaning.
Bearing that in mind, can we identify and describe differences between what we call Zazaca and English?
In English, we mark the source of information for our claims by using parentheticals or adverbs. So if we want to claim that Bill's a doctor, but we want to convey the fact that we don't have intimate personal knowledge of that fact, we say things like, Bill's a doctor, they say. Or apparently Bill is a doctor. In Zazaca, this kind of information is conveyed by the choice of the form of the verb that you use in the sentence. So when you want to convey that your source of information is indirect, that you don't know about it personally, you didn't see it, you use the perfect form of the verb instead of the unmarked past form.
Zazaca has some sounds that English doesn't have, and vice versa. There are sounds in English that don't appear in Zazaca. And of course there are other differences in the syntax. For example, Zazaca has case endings and we don't in English.
So it doesn't have articles. It has the verb following both the subject and object. What is curious to me is that sometimes you can have things after the verb, but not always, and I still haven't figured out when you can have it and when you can't.
The tense of the sentence has an effect on the forms of the nouns, which is unusual. It's not something you find in English and lots of other languages. So I would say mukadavda but is skatavdana to, I guess. right? So you change that from to as. The subject of the sentence changes its case depending on the tense of the sentence.
In what way has the discovery of these phenomena enriched your ability to do field work with a native speaker?
So this book is about how to do field work, not only in foreign countries, but working with native speakers of languages that we don't know, like we've been doing with Gulchem. Often linguists just work from books and grammars, or they work on languages that they know or someone they know knows, languages that are easily accessible. So we had to learn how to do things a little bit differently to work with languages that aren't already described.
Yes, I think that a number of the students are interested in carrying forward their research. One semester is very difficult to get anything conclusive done. We're just getting familiar with the nature of the language and what some interesting problems are, but we need more time to investigate them further.
One of the frustrating things about this course is that we spend a semester working on a language which is just about enough time to see how interesting it is, and then the course stops. And so I definitely want to continue to explore some of the things that I've learned in the